Layer's law number 3 is that you should hug your quotations. And what I mean by this is that you should wrap your quotations in context. First, by setting up the quotes so the reader knows what they're going to see. So you're kind of anticipating what the quote's going to be about. And then after you're done quoting, explaining what the quote was. And the reason why it's important to emphasize this law is that often students will just throw quotes into a paper without any context or explanation, kind of assuming that the quote is self-evident, that it just automatically screams to the reader what the writer intended to convey. But you can't make that assumption. These quotations are not self-evident, or you can't assume that they're self-evident. You need to walk the reader through these quotes as well. And so you do that by providing context beforehand, then you give the quote, and then you provide context afterwards. So you anticipate, quote, explain. And if you do this, again, the possibility that a reader misunderstands the quotation and your intention behind it is greatly limited and greatly reduced. And also, it allows the reader to really understand and appreciate the significance of the quote in ways that they won't if you just kind of throw the quotation in there. So to give an example of this, of an uncontextualized or unhugged quote. Weber was concerned with rationality. Quote, "The fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, the disenchantment of the world." Unquote. Weber also talks about, what do we see here? We see a general topic or issue being raised. Then there's this quote thrown in there, but there's no, again, setting up this quote. There's no explanation for what the connection is between what we're seeing here and what we're seeing in the quote. There's no anticipation of what the reader's going to see. And then there's no explanation. And here the author just moves on to a different topic. If someone who's not familiar with Weber reads this, they're going to understand some of what the author was trying to say. Weber's concerned about rationality. There's this thing about disenchantment, but their level of understanding is going to be really low, and there's a lot that they don't know. Instead, what we want to do is give the reader a lot more context, and by giving them that context, he or she will be able to appreciate not only how this point is connected to this quotation, but what this quotation means and why it's significant and why they should care about it. Here's an example of a quotation that's been hugged or wrapped in context. So we start, Weber was concerned with rationality, which is part of the quote we had before, but now there's more context being outlined. And how, as the world was increasingly rationalized, we'd come to live in worlds stripped of all its magical and mystical elements. Weber talks about this in terms of a process of disenchantment. Here, we're kind of fleshing out what does rationalize mean. We live in a world that's stripped of its magical and mystical elements. We see that Weber talks about this stripping in terms of disenchantment, and we're introducing disenchantment here because we're going to see it in the quotation. So context and anticipation are being offered before we get to the quote itself. Now we get to the quote. "The fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, the disenchantment of the world." The reader is in a much better position to understand what this phrase, the disenchantment of the world, means because all this context has been provided. But we don't stop there. We're kind of anticipating what the reader is going to see with the quote. Then we offer the quote itself. And now we're going to offer an explanation of what that quote means, just to make sure the reader is on board with what we're trying to say. So, and again, providing context at the end completes the hug. So in this case, what Weber means by this is that when everything is rationally planned and organized, there'll be little room for unanticipated and spontaneous action, as well as for forms of thoughts such as religious experiences, moral beliefs, and magic and spirituality that lay outside of the bounds of rationality. In comparison to the unhugged quote, we've added 3 sentences, and those 3 sentences make a qualitative difference in the level of understanding and appreciation that a reader can have of the quote that the writer was using. It makes the quote much more powerful than if it's just thrown in there without context, because the reader just can't understand it or why it's significant. So hugging your quotes is really, really, really important. You're contextualizing it, you're anticipating a quote, you give the quote itself, and then you're explaining what the reader saw in that quotation. Hugging your quotes makes them much more powerful and effective. All right, now let's turn our attention to Layer's Law number 4. And this law deals with the issue of explanation. Your job as a writer is to explain to the reader what's going on in your paper or sections of it. And you don't want to take statements that you make as being self-evident. We have a tendency to try to state our points, and often we state our points in a way that we do because they make sense to us. They're self-evident to us, but we can't assume that just stating a point is going to be self-evident to the reader. Instead, we need to offer explanations of the points we're trying to make so the reader can follow along with us and make sure the readers are on the same page.